The morning mist clung to the jagged peaks of the Sierra Madre Oriental like ghostly fingers, concealing what would soon become one of the most decisive battlefields of the Mexican-American War. General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna stood atop the rocky prominence of Cerro Gordo, his weathered hands gripping his field glasses as he surveyed the narrow mountain pass below. It was April 18th, 1847, and the Mexican President General believed he had chosen the perfect killing ground. "They will come up this road like sheep to slaughter," Santa Anna muttered to his aide-de-camp, Colonel Miguel Miraman. The pass of Cerro Gordo stretched before them like a deadly funnel, barely wide enough for two wagons to pass abreast. On both sides, steep canyon walls rose 300 feet, creating what military strategists would call a perfect choke point. Santa Anna had positioned 12,000 of Mexico's finest soldiers along these heights, their cannons trained downward at the inevitable approach of the American invaders. The Mexican fortifications were formidable by any measure. Artillery. Batteries crowned every viable firing position, while infantry entrenchments snaked along the ridgelines like stone serpents. The main road from Veracruz to Mexico City had no alternative route through these mountains, or so Santa Anna believed. For 3 days, his engineers had reinforced the natural barriers, creating what appeared to be an impregnable fortress in the clouds. Below in the valley, the dust clouds of the approaching American army had been visible since dawn. Major General Winfield Scott's forces, numbering nearly 9,000 men, had been advancing inland from their landing at Veracruz with methodical precision. Scott, known to his men as Old Fuss and Feathers for his attention to military protocol, had already demonstrated his tactical brilliance in the siege of Veracruz. Now facing the most daunting obstacle in his march to Mexico City, the 61-year-old commander would need every ounce of his strategic genius. Captain Robert Edward Lee of the Corps of Engineers rode at the head of the American reconnaissance party, his sharp eyes studying the forbidding terrain ahead. The 39-year-old Virginian had already distinguished himself in this campaign. But the sight before him would have given pause to even the most confident officer. The Mexican positions appeared virtually unassailable from the front, with interlocking fields of fire that would turn any direct assault into a massacre. As historical accounts from the National Archives would later document, the terrain itself seemed to conspire against the American advance. The main road climbed steadily through a narrow defile, with Mexican artillery commanding every yard of the approach. To attempt a frontal assault would be tantamount to suicide, yet there seemed to be no alternative. The mountains rose on either side like walls of stone and scrub brush, their slopes appearing too steep and tangled for any significant military movement. But Lee was not a man to accept impossibility without thorough investigation. As his reconnaissance party approached the Mexican outposts, drawing scattered rifle fire from the heights, the future Confederate general was already formulating a daring plan that would reshape the entire campaign. The key lay not in what could be seen from the valley floor, but in what might be hidden among the seemingly impassable peaks to the north and south of the Mexican positions. Santa Anna's confidence was understandable. Throughout his tumultuous career, the veteran general had learned to read terrain like a book, and everything about Cerro Gordo suggested American defeat. The narrow pass would force Scott's army into a bottleneck where superior numbers meant nothing, while the elevated Mexican positions provided both defensive advantage and devastating fields of fire. Victory here would not only halt the American advance but potentially destroy their entire expedition, forcing a negotiated peace that would preserve Mexican independence. Yet in war, as in life, absolute certainties often prove to be dangerous illusions, and the mountain fortress of Cerro Gordo was about to become the stage for one of military history's most brilliant flanking maneuvers. Captain Robert Lee wiped the sweat from his brow as he crouched behind a boulder, Mexican musket balls whistling overhead. It was April 19th, 1847, and he had been probing the seemingly impenetrable Mexican defenses for hours. What he discovered in those dangerous hours would change the course of American military history and establish his reputation as one of the Army's most gifted tactical minds. "Sir, there's something you need to see," whispered Lieutenant Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, gesturing toward a barely visible deer trail that snaked up the northern slope of the ridge system. The 29-year-old Louisiana Creole had been scouting ahead when he noticed what appeared to be a natural pathway, obscured by thick chaparral and rocky outcroppings. Most officers would have dismissed it as impassable for military purposes, but Lee saw something else entirely. General Winfield Scott had given Lee explicit orders to find an alternative to the suicidal frontal assault that Santa Anna clearly expected. The Mexican positions were simply too strong to take by direct attack. 12,000 well-entrenched defenders with artillery support could hold off twice their number advancing up that narrow pass. But as Lee studied the terrain through his field glasses, he began to perceive the outline of an audacious flanking movement that could turn the entire Mexican position. The key lay in understanding what the Mexicans could not see from their elevated positions. While Santa Anna's forces commanded excellent views of the main road and the obvious approaches, the complex topography of the Sierra Madre created blind spots and hidden ravines that an experienced engineer might exploit. The deer trail that Beauregard had discovered was merely the beginning. Lee could see how it might be extended and improved to allow the passage of troops in significant numbers. Working with almost reckless courage, Lee and his small reconnaissance team spent the entire day mapping a route that would take them far to the left of the Mexican positions. The path was treacherous, requiring soldiers to scramble over loose rock, through thorny undergrowth, and along precipitous ledges that would challenge even experienced mountaineers. But it was possible, and more importantly, it would emerge behind Santa Anna's main defensive line, turning the Mexican fortress into a trap for its own defenders. That evening, as the American Army made camp in the valley below Cerro Gordo, Lee presented his findings to General Scott and the assembled divisional commanders. The candlelit war council gathered around a rough map that Lee had sketched during his dangerous reconnaissance, showing not only the discovered route but also the precise locations of Mexican artillery, batteries, and troop concentrations. "Gentlemen," Scott began, his imposing figure casting long shadows in the flickering light, "Captain Lee has discovered what may be our salvation or our damnation, depending upon the skill with which we execute what I propose. The plan that emerged from that council would require splitting the American force, sending the bulk of the Army on a grueling flanking march while leaving enough troops visible in the valley to maintain the illusion of an impending frontal assault." Brigadier General David Emmanuel Twiggs, commanding the 1st Division, volunteered his men for the most dangerous assignment. The 60-year-old Georgian was known for his aggressive tactics and personal courage, qualities that would be essential for the success of Lee's plan. Twiggs understood that his division would bear the brunt of the fighting once they emerged behind Mexican lines, facing enemies who would be fighting with the desperation of trapped men. The technical challenges were enormous. Artillery pieces would need to be disassembled and carried by hand over terrain that barely accommodated foot soldiers. Ammunition, supplies, and even the wounded would have to be transported along paths that existed more in Lee's imagination than in reality. One mistake, one section of impassable ground that had been missed in reconnaissance, and the entire flanking force could find itself stranded on the Fanbu mountainside while Santa Anna concentrated his full strength against the remaining American troops in the valley. As the officers dispersed to prepare their commands, Lee remained behind with Scott, refining the details of what military historians would later recognize as one of the war's most daring tactical innovations. The young engineer knew that his reputation, and possibly his life, now depended upon the accuracy of his hasty reconnaissance and the viability of a route that existed largely in his confident imagination. Santa Anna, meanwhile, spent that same evening reinforcing his already formidable positions. completely unaware that his mountain fortress was about to be turned inside out by American audacity and engineering skill. The Mexican general retired that night, confident that the morrow would bring decisive victory and the effective end of the American threat to Mexico City. The darkness before dawn on April 20th, 1847, hung over the Sierra Madre like a heavy blanket, broken only by the muffled sounds of 3,000 American soldiers preparing for one of the most audacious flanking movements in military history. Brigadier General David Twiggs moved among his men with quiet efficiency, ensuring that every detail of the treacherous march ahead had been carefully planned and rehearsed. Captain Lee had spent the previous day improving the route he had discovered, clearing obstacles and marking the most dangerous passages with strips of white cloth that would be barely visible in the pre-dawn gloom. The path that had seemed challenging enough for a small reconnaissance party would now need to accommodate an entire division, complete with artillery pieces broken down and carried by hand through terrain that would test the endurance of even the most hardened veterans. Colonel William Selby Harney of the 2nd Dragoons had volunteered his mounted riflemen for the advance guard, though they would be fighting on foot once the serious climbing began. The 47-year-old Tennessee frontiersman understood mountain warfare better than most regular Army officers, having spent years fighting Native American tribes in terrain just as challenging as the Sierra Madre. His men, armed with the new model 1841 Mississippi rifles, would provide the firepower needed to secure the flanking force's objective once they reached their destination. The column began moving at 3 o'clock in the morning, with Lee himself leading the way along the barely visible trail. Behind him stretched a line of soldiers that seemed to disappear into the darkness, each man maintaining contact with the soldier ahead by touch and whispered communication. The slightest sound might alert Mexican sentries to their presence, turning tactical surprise into disaster. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the true difficulty of the enterprise became apparent. Soldiers carrying disassembled cannon parts found themselves clinging to rocky ledges with one hand while maintaining their grip on 60-pound artillery components with the other. The mountainous terrain that had seemed merely challenging in daylight became a nightmarish obstacle course in the darkness, with loose rocks shifting underfoot and thorny chaparral tearing at uniforms and exposed skin. Lieutenant Beauregard, serving as one of Lee's guides, had marked the most treacherous sections of the route, with small cairns of stones that were barely visible even to men who knew what to look for. The young engineer found himself constantly moving up and down the column, ensuring that no section of the flanking force had become lost in the maze of ravines and false ridges that characterized this part of the Sierra Madre. Meanwhile, in the valley below, General Scott maintained the elaborate deception that would be crucial to the plan's success. Campfires burned brightly throughout the American positions, and work parties made conspicuous preparations for what appeared to be a direct assault on the Mexican fortifications. Artillery crews went through the motions of sighting their guns on Santa Ana's positions, while infantry units conducted obvious reconnaissance of the main road leading up to Cerro Gordo. The Mexican commander, observing these preparations from his headquarters atop the central ridge, felt his confidence growing with each passing hour. Everything he could see confirmed his assessment that the Americans had no choice but to attempt the suicidal frontal attack that would result in their destruction. Santa Ana had fought enough battles to recognize the signs of an army preparing for a desperate assault, and Scott's forces seemed to be following the predictable pattern of commanders with no viable alternatives. As referenced in military dispatches preserved in the Library of Congress, the Mexican general spent much of that night moving between his artillery positions, ensuring that his gunners were prepared to deliver devastating enfilade fire against any American advance up the main road. His 12,000 soldiers were well positioned and motivated by the knowledge that they were defending their homeland against foreign invaders. Victory at Cerro Gordo would not only halt the American Advance but might well end the war on terms favorable to Mexico. But high above the valley floor, Lee's flanking column continued its tortuous progress through terrain that no military manual had ever described. By dawn, they would need to be in position behind the Mexican lines, ready to launch an attack that would turn Santa Anna's impregnable fortress into a death trap for its defenders. The success of the entire campaign, and possibly the war itself, now depended upon the endurance of soldiers, carrying impossible loads over impassable ground in complete darkness. As the first hint of gray light began to appear on the eastern horizon, Lee checked his pocket watch and quickened the pace. Time was running out, and the most difficult part of the climb still lay ahead. The first rays of sunlight on April 20th, 1847, revealed a sight that would have seemed impossible to Santa Anna had he been able to observe it from his command post atop Cerro Gordo. 3,000 American soldiers, led by Captain Robert Lee and General David Twiggs, had achieved what the Mexican commander had deemed utterly impossible. They had hauled themselves, their weapons, and even disassembled artillery pieces over terrain that military textbooks declared impassable for organized military formations. Lee crouched behind a rocky outcropping, studying the Mexican positions spread below him like pieces on a chessboard. The night march had been a grueling success, bringing Twiggs' division to a position that completely flanked Santa Anna's supposedly impregnable defenses. Mexican soldiers could be seen moving casually about their morning routines, completely unaware that 3,000 enemy troops now occupied the high ground behind their lines. "General Twiggs," Lee whispered, pointing toward a cluster of Mexican artillery positions that commanded the main road. "If we can seize those guns, we'll have Santa Anna's entire army in a crossfire." The plan required precise timing and coordination between the flanking force and Scott's main army, which would launch its own attack the moment they heard gunfire from the heights. Colonel Harney's riflemen had already begun moving into assault positions, their Mississippi rifles trained on Mexican artillery crews who remained blissfully unaware of the danger approaching from their blind side. The irony was not lost on experienced American officers. Santa Anna's obsession with defending against a frontal assault had left his flanks virtually unguarded, creating the very vulnerability that Lee's reconnaissance had identified. At exactly 7 o'clock in the morning, Twiggs gave the signal for the assault to begin. The mountain silence was shattered by the crack of American rifles and the war cries of soldiers who had spent hours climbing through darkness to reach this moment. Mexican artillerymen, caught completely by surprise, found themselves under attack from directions they had never imagined possible. The shock effect was immediate and devastating. Mexican soldiers who had been confidently preparing to repel an American assault from the valley below suddenly found themselves taking fire from the heights behind their own positions. Panic spread through the Mexican ranks as officers shouted contradictory orders and tried to understand how enemy forces had appeared in locations that were supposed to be physically impossible to reach. Santa Anna himself was caught completely off guard, awakening to the sound of gunfire from what should have been his secure rear areas. Racing from his headquarters, the Mexican general encountered scenes of chaos that would haunt him for the rest of his military career. His carefully planned defensive positions were being rolled up from behind by an enemy force that had materialized as if from thin air. Down in the valley, General Scott heard the prearranged signal and immediately launched his own coordinated assault. The American troops who had spent the night maintaining the deception of an impending frontal attack now became part of a genuine offensive that caught the Mexicans between two fires. Artillery batteries that had been positioned to devastate an assault up the main road found themselves under attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The Mexican defense began to collapse with stunning rapidity. Soldiers who had been supremely confident in their impregnable positions now found themselves trapped in a deadly crossfire between Twiggs' flanking force and Scott's frontal assault. Artillery pieces that had dominated the battlefield minutes before were now being captured by American troops who seemed to be attacking from every direction at once. Brigadier General Gideon Johnson Pillow, commanding one of Scott's assault columns, led his men up the main road with an enthusiasm that bordered on recklessness. The 39-year-old Tennessee politician turned general had been criticized for his lack of military experience, but the success of the flanking movement had transformed what should have been a suicidal frontal assault into a relatively straightforward advance against demoralized defenders. Captain Lee, meanwhile, found himself directing the emplacement of captured Mexican artillery against its former owners. The guns that Santa Anna had positioned to command the approaches to Cerro Gordo were now being turned against Mexican positions that had no protection from fire originating from their own high ground. The tactical situation had been completely reversed in less than an hour. Mexican resistance, though sporadic, remained fierce in several locations where officers managed to rally their men for counterattacks against the advancing Americans. Colonel Merriman, Santa Anna's aide-de-camp, organized a desperate charge against Harney's riflemen, hoping to recapture the key artillery positions that commanded the entire battlefield. The attack was brave but doomed American firepower, and superior positioning made Mexican counter-assaults virtually suicidal. As the morning sun climbed higher over the Sierra Madre, it became clear that Santa Anna's mountain fortress had become a death trap for its own defenders. The brilliant flanking movement conceived by Lee and executed by Twiggs had achieved complete tactical surprise, turning what should have been an American disaster into a Mexican catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. By 10 o'clock on the morning of April 20th, 1847, the Battle of Cerro Gordo had transformed from a carefully planned Mexican defensive stand into a chaotic rout that would echo through military academies for generations to come. Santa Anna's 12,000 troops, caught between the hammer of Twiggs' flanking force and the anvil of Scott's frontal assault, were collapsing in disorder that defied their commander's desperate attempts to maintain military discipline. General Santa Anna himself narrowly escaped capture when a company of Tennessee volunteers, led by Captain William Bowen Campbell, overran his command post atop the central ridge. The Mexican commander fled so hastily that he left behind his personal effects, including his ceremonial wooden leg, a prosthetic that would become one of the war's most famous trophies, eventually displayed in the Illinois state capitol as a testament to American tactical superiority. Captain Lee, now serving as the eyes and ears of General Scott's headquarters, moved constantly across the battlefield to coordinate the converging American attacks. His engineering background proved invaluable in directing artillery fire from the captured Mexican positions, turning Santa Anna's own guns against formations that had no protection from fire originating from their rear. The young Virginian had not only planned the flanking movement, but was now orchestrating its devastating exploitation. Colonel Harney's dragoons, fighting dismounted among the rocky heights, had captured the key Mexican artillery battery that commanded the main road. The Missouri frontiersman directed his riflemen with the skill of a veteran Indian fighter, using the broken terrain to maximum advantage while systematically destroying organized Mexican resistance. Each captured gun was immediately turned against remaining Mexican positions, multiplying the effect of the original flanking movement. The psychological impact of the surprise attack proved as devastating as its tactical consequences. Mexican soldiers who had spent days preparing for an American frontal assault found themselves completely disoriented by attacks from directions they had never imagined possible. Unit cohesion collapsed as officers lost control of their commands, and individual soldiers began seeking personal survival rather than collective resistance. Brigadier General James Shields, commanding one of Scott's assault columns, pressed his attack up the main road with increasing confidence as Mexican resistance crumbled before him. The 37-year-old Irish immigrant had distinguished himself throughout the campaign, and the success of Lee's flanking movement now allowed him to exploit his natural aggressiveness without the prohibitive casualties that a frontal assault would normally have entailed. Mexican casualties were mounting at an alarming rate, not from the fierce fighting that Santa Anna had anticipated, but from the panic and confusion that accompanied the collapse of their defensive positions. Soldiers attempting to retreat found themselves caught in crossfires from multiple directions, while officers who tried to rally their men were cut down by American sharpshooters, who had occupied commanding positions throughout the Mexican rear. Areas. The capture of Mexican artillery proved particularly significant, as these guns had been positioned to command every approach to Cerro Gordo. In American hands, the same weapons that should have devastated Scott's army were now being used to complete the destruction of Santa Anna's forces. Battery after battery fell to coordinated attacks that combined the tactical surprise of the flanking movement with the overwhelming firepower of captured artillery. As the morning progressed, what had begun as tactical defeat evolved into strategic disaster for Mexican arms. The Army of the East, which Santa Anna had assembled to halt the American advance on Mexico City, was being systematically destroyed by forces that had achieved complete tactical surprise through audacious planning and brilliant execution. The mountain fortress that was supposed to be the graveyard of American ambitions had instead become the tomb of Mexican hopes for military victory. General Pillow's division, advancing from the valley floor, encountered increasingly demoralized Mexican resistance as Santa Anna's defensive system continued to collapse. The politician general's lack of formal military training seemed irrelevant when facing enemies who had lost both cohesion and will to fight. American casualties remained remarkably light considering the strength of the positions they were assaulting. By noon, organized Mexican resistance had ceased throughout most of the battlefield, though individual units continued fighting desperate rearguard actions to cover the retreat of their comrades. The Army of the East, which had numbered 12,000 men at dawn, was disintegrating into scattered fragments fleeing toward Mexico City, with nothing to show for their efforts except catastrophic losses and shattered morale. Captain Lee, surveying the battlefield from the heights of Cerro Gordo, could see the full extent of American tactical success. The flanking movement that had seemed so risky in the pre-dawn darkness had achieved results beyond the most optimistic predictions, converting what should have been American defeat into Mexican disaster through the application of superior planning, reconnaissance, and execution. The afternoon sun of April 20th, 1847, cast long shadows across the broken Mexican positions at Cerro Gordo, illuminating a battlefield that would fundamentally alter the course of the Mexican-American war and establish reputations that would echo through the coming decades. General Winfield Scott surveyed the scene of his greatest tactical triumph, knowing that the brilliant flanking movement had accomplished far more than simply winning a single battle. It had broken the back of organized Mexican resistance to the American advance on Mexico City. The casualties told the story of a complete tactical victory. American losses numbered fewer than 400 killed and wounded, while Mexican casualties approached 3,000, with an additional 3,000 taken prisoner, along with 43 artillery pieces and thousands of small arms. More significantly, the psychological impact of the defeat had shattered Mexican confidence in their ability to halt the American invasion through conventional military means. Captain Robert Lee emerged from the battle with his reputation transformed. From promising engineer to tactical genius, his reconnaissance and planning of the flanking movement had demonstrated an understanding of terrain and tactical possibilities that marked him as one of the Army's most gifted officers. General Scott's official dispatches would praise Lee's daring reconnaissance and invaluable service, launching a career that would culminate in overall command of Confederate forces during the Civil War. Santa Anna's escape, though personally humiliating, represented a strategic disaster for Mexican arms. The Army of the East, which had been assembled as Mexico's last hope for stopping the American advance, had been effectively destroyed as a fighting force. Survivors streaming toward Mexico City carried tales of American tactical brilliance that undermined morale throughout. The remaining Mexican military formations, the captured Mexican artillery, proved particularly significant, not merely for its immediate tactical value, but for what it represented about the changing nature of warfare in the Americas. European-trained Mexican officers had positioned their guns according to traditional defensive principles, only to discover that American tactical innovation could turn supposedly impregnable positions into death traps through audacious flanking movements and superior reconnaissance. General David Twiggs, whose division had executed the dangerous night march and dawn assault, found his reputation enhanced by the successful operation. The Georgian's willingness to trust Lee's reconnaissance and lead his men over seemingly impossible terrain demonstrated the kind of tactical audacity that would characterize American military operations throughout the remainder of the war. His soldiers, who had endured hours of grueling climbing and darkness, were now being hailed as heroes whose endurance had made tactical brilliance possible. The political consequences of the victory extended far beyond the immediate military situation. News of the triumph at Cerro Gordo would reach Washington within weeks, providing President James Knox Polk with the political capital needed to continue prosecuting the war, despite growing opposition from Whig politicians who questioned both its necessity and its cost. American public opinion, previously divided about the conflict, would rally behind Scott's army following reports of their tactical brilliance in the mountains. For Mexico, the defeat at Cerro Gordo represented more than just another lost battle. It marked the effective end of their ability to halt the American advance through conventional military means. The destruction of the Army of the East left Mexico City virtually defenseless against Scott's methodical advance, forcing Mexican leadership to contemplate either negotiated surrender or a desperate turn to guerrilla warfare that would prove equally futile. Colonel William Harney's dragoons, having fought dismounted throughout the battle, had captured several Mexican battle flags that would become treasured regimental trophies. The Missouri frontiersman's tactical skill in exploiting the initial surprise had demonstrated how American frontier experience could be adapted to conventional military operations, providing lessons that would prove valuable in future conflicts. The engineering aspects of the victory would be studied in military academies for decades to come, as Lee's successful reconnaissance and route finding through impossible terrain demonstrated the crucial importance of detailed terrain analysis in tactical planning. The Battle of Cerro Gordo would become a classic example of how superior intelligence and audacious planning could overcome apparently insurmountable defensive advantages. As evening fell over the Sierra Madre, American soldiers occupied positions that had seemed impossible to assault just 24 hours earlier. The mountain fortress that Santa Anna had believed would be the graveyard of American ambitions had instead become the foundation of American tactical reputation and the stepping stone to Mexico City. The brilliant flanking movement that began with Lee's dangerous reconnaissance had achieved results that would reshape the strategic balance of power throughout North America. The weeks following the Battle of Cerro Gordo would see the full strategic consequences of the American tactical triumph begin to unfold across Mexico and the United States. By May 1, 1847, General Scott's army had resumed its advance toward Mexico City, now facing only token resistance from demoralized Mexican forces who had lost faith in their ability to halt the seemingly unstoppable American war machine. Captain Robert Lee's role in the victory had established him as one of the Army's most promising young officers, leading to his selection for increasingly important assignments throughout the remainder of the campaign. His ability to read terrain and identify tactical opportunities that others missed would become legendary within military circles, establishing principles of reconnaissance and flanking movements that would influence American military doctrine for generations. The engineering skills that had made the Cerro Gordo flanking movement possible would later be applied to both sides during the Civil War, when Lee would use similar tactical brilliance against his former comrades. The broader implications of the victory extended far beyond military tactics into the realm of national destiny. The destruction of Santa Anna's army at Cerro Gordo had effectively ended Mexican hopes of negotiating from a position of strength, accelerating the American advance toward Mexico City and the eventual Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that would transfer vast territories to the United States. The tactical brilliance displayed in the Sierra Madre had strategic consequences that would reshape the map of North America. General Winfield Scott's reputation as America's greatest military strategist was cemented by the Cerro Gordo campaign, though he was careful to credit his subordinates for their crucial contributions to the victory. His official reports praised Lee's reconnaissance, Twiggs' execution of the flanking movement, and Harney's tactical exploitation of the initial surprise, demonstrating the kind of generous leadership that had made him beloved by his soldiers. Throughout a long and distinguished career, the battle's influence on military education would prove particularly significant, as the United States Military Academy at West Point began incorporating detailed studies of the Cerro Gordo flanking movement into its curriculum. Future generations of American officers would learn the importance of thorough reconnaissance, tactical surprise, and the creative exploitation of terrain, features that conventional wisdom deemed impassable. The principles demonstrated by Lee and executed by Twiggs would be applied in conflicts from the Civil War through the Second World War. Mexican military leaders, meanwhile, were forced to confront the reality that their European-trained officer corps had been outmaneuvered by American tactical innovation rooted in frontier experience and engineering expertise. The defeat at Cerro Gordo prompted a fundamental reassessment of Mexican military doctrine, though by then it was too late to affect the outcome of the war. Santa Anna's flight from the battlefield, leaving behind his wooden leg and his reputation, symbolized the collapse of Mexican confidence in conventional military resistance. The technological aspects of the victory were equally significant, as the battle demonstrated how new weapons like the Mississippi rifle could be effectively employed in difficult terrain when combined with superior tactics and training. Harney's dragoons had proven that American marksmanship, enhanced by improved firearms, could dominate battlefields where traditional European tactics would have failed. This combination of technological innovation and tactical creativity would become a hallmark of American military operations. The political consequences continued to resonate throughout both nations for decades. In the United States, the victory at Cerro Gordo provided President Polk with the military success needed to justify continued prosecution of the war, while in Mexico, it hastened the political collapse that would lead to territorial concessions unimaginable before the campaign began. The tactical brilliance displayed in the Sierra Madre had achieved strategic objectives that would influence the development of both nations throughout the 19th century. As historians would later recognize, the Battle of Cerro Gordo represented a watershed moment in American military history, demonstrating that innovative tactics and superior leadership could overcome seemingly impossible odds. The flanking movement that began as a desperate attempt to avoid a suicidal frontal assault had evolved into a masterpiece of military planning and execution that would be studied and emulated for generations to come.